Attackers have had many metas where they are dominant in Pokemon Unite, but right now attackers are what look like to be the worst role in the entire game, with the most Pokemon sitting below a 50% win rate out of all of the classes. And that is really interesting because while there are a ton of attackers in the game, there are more all-rounders, and all-rounders are generally doing better than attackers, even though some of them are underperforming. So what is going on with attackers in Unite? How do we fix it, and what attackers are doing well? Hi everybody, Jake, your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw. Let's get into attackers. Without question, at least in my mind, the weakest role in the game currently. Attackers have had an up and down history in Unite, and there are no question that some of the most popular Pokemon they've brought into the game, like Greninja, one they give you for free by the way, is an attacker. There are so many popular attackers that people want to play. Maybe you have noticed this. My personal take is that oftentimes you will see the worst player on your team insta-locking an attacker, but we are also talking, when we're looking at win rates, about the top players in the game. Even amongst top players and amongst top teams, attackers are struggling. I think there were some questions, at least in my mind, as to whether or not attackers would perform better or worse on the new map, right? When you look at the new pit around Groudon instead of Rayquaza, it's more open, which gives attackers and Pokemon like that, Pokemon that don't want to get, dove on by speedsters and all-rounders, a little more information as to what their opponents are doing. And I have found that that is pretty valuable, but it clearly is not valuable enough to propel attackers in any meaningful way. And there are a few meta reasons as to why I think attackers are falling behind. And yes, later in this video, I will talk about a few attackers that are doing well and some tips that can hopefully make your attacker gameplay a little bit better. I'll also be posting a few videos throughout the week going over some strong attackers right now and maybe some ways that you could play them and take the most advantage of a class that still does pretty well as long as it has a few things on your team in place. So obviously one issue with attackers is that they are quite fragile, right? That's exactly how the role is meant to be. They are high damage dealing Pokemon, oftentimes in burst, but not always. Sometimes they're consistently high damage dealing, like an auto attacker, Cinderace or something like that. But oftentimes high burst damage Pokemon with very little mobility in their kit that makes it a little difficult when they get hunted down by some of the all-rounders and speedsters on the other side. Even some defenders that can displace the team. You think of Mamoswine jumping in with an Earthquake and grabbing with an Ice Fang. Once that has happened to most of the attackers on the roster, as long as the enemy team isn't fully incompetent, that Pokemon is going down, right? They're squishy, they have very little mobility, which can be tough. They also, generally as a class, require a ton of experience, and this is where you think the new map could possibly help them, but given how fast everything has become, I do think it hurts them. Many attackers, like you look at something like Greninja. Greninja needs to evolve multiple times. It needs to hit level 9. In fact, it doesn't even really get a reasonable move until level 7 that is going to help it. It performs pretty poorly in lane, not the absolute worst thing, but not great either. And then in the central area, it's okay, but it's still a lot slower than a lot of the meta threats right now. In fact, it really feels like the faster you are in the meta, and that's not just speedsters, there are a lot of Pokemon that kind of behave like this. The faster you are in the meta, the quicker you are at clearing farm, the quicker you are to lane to help your team fight over some of the objectives, the more valuable that Pokemon is. And if you look at some of the top win rates in the game currently, a lot of them are Pokemon that either are great in lane or are incredible at farming and getting experience fast. And if you just take a look at the top 13 Pokemon in win rate right now, you see some really interesting stuff. Zacian doing amazing because, well, Zacian is great in lane. Zarina has so much carry potential. Urshifu doing really, really well because once it hits level 5, it's incredible. Blaze, again, you can see 4 all-rounders here. Now we have a speedster, a supporter, another speedster, a defender, an all-rounder, and finally in the top 10, we have our first attacker, which is Delphox. Really interesting situation with Delphox, which we'll get into. But as you keep going, you have another all-rounder, a supporter, another all-rounder. As we keep going down the list, we do have some attackers start to trickle in. There are some really good ones in the meta, but man, if you look at the bottom of this list, holy moly, do we have a ton of attackers. Mewtwo Y and Mewtwo X obviously just receiving nerfs, so we have a defender, then attacker, 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 all-rounder, attacker, 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 all-rounder, attacker. You could keep going for a while. Lots of attackers in this bottom portion of the meta. So again, while not all of them are struggling, a decent portion of them are struggling, and I think a huge reason for that is bad in lane and not as good in the central area as many of the quick Pokemon that are dominating right now. You also have to look at them compared to some of the other roles, and the fact that they get online so much later means you might not be able to slow down something on the other side. So you compare them to all-rounders, right? All-rounders are oftentimes better in lane. There are a few really good lane attackers, by the way, but they're often better in lane. They do similar damage, like they have good burst potential. They also have more mobility, and they're quite a bit tankier. And unlike most of the attackers, you have Pokemon that are all-rounders, like we think it's Zacian that we looked at on the list, we think of Blaziken. They can handle an objective all by themselves and have great secure if the enemy tries to contest. Then you have speedsters, a role that I think is mostly crushing it in the meta right now, with a few of them being extremely good. These Pokemon are just really fast, able to get somewhere quickly, and if they're a really good Pokemon at level 5, like I'm thinking of something like Absol, or level 4, like Leafeon, they're making it into a fight super early, and they're super powerful. Whereas a Pokemon like Cinderace at level 5, even if they're coming from the central area, does not have the same influence over an early fight. When you look at them compared to speedsters and compared to some all-rounders, of course they have the advantage of being ranged and the advantage of having kind of this not only range but long-range burst damage that can help your team kind of break through some of the thicker walls that you might be running into if your opponents are playing, you know, a supporter like Clefable and something like Snorlax. These are really tough Pokemon to take down without a considerable amount of burst damage. Attackers still have decent value, but I do think other Pokemon are just outclassing them and outpacing them. And one interesting thing to note, when we're taking a look at a lot of the attackers that aren't doing so well in this meta, a ton of them are Pokemon that are actually pretty good in lane, right? Like Pikachu, pretty good in lane. Alola Ninetales, pretty good in lane. Sylveon has been in a weird situation for a while. Cramorant was buffed at one point, so the developers had to nerf it 50 times in a row. So that's why you don't see too much Cram. But in general, a lot of these attackers, even if they have decent secure, are not making it to the end game and doing super well. And I do think it's because of some of the Pokemon just being so unbelievably quick, leveling so fast, and scaling in such a great way that they can shut down some of these squishier Pokemon. Now, let's be reasonable about one thing. If you're great with a Pokemon and you know how to use it, you know how to space extremely well, which I think is very important for attackers, I still think you could be a really important threat in a match, and there's a lot that these Pokemon can do. You'll still see a lot of competitive teams having something filling this role on their roster, and I think with more coordination, you're doing better. I do think with less coordination, solos, even duos, trios, you have a harder time keeping this Pokemon around. If you can insulate and protect an attacker as a team, they can absolutely dominate. So what can you do as an attacker player to perform a little bit better in your matches? First, I would say play a different role. No, I'm kidding. If you're going to be an attacker, I wouldn't be playing an attacker unless you don't have another attacker on the team, right? I think a lot of teams run into the situation where they pick multiple attackers because the Pokemon are fun and cool, and they remember that time they got a Penta KO with Greninja, so they want to recapture that moment. However, if your team already has an attacker, I think you're probably set in this meta. There are some situations you could get away with a few, but it's, I think, the role that you see the most double picking of. I could be wrong about that. Let me know what you think in the comments. All rounders could be kind of close, but I feel like I don't see any role be double picked on a team with less value than attackers. That I'm 100% sure on. I never see a role double picked where I think, boy, this is really rough that now we have Decidueye and Cinderace on the squad. It feels like it's always attackers when you're in this situation. The next thing you can do, and this can be a little tricky for some of you solo queue players out there, which is 90% of the games I play, when you're playing an attacker, you do have to figure out a way to play around your team because you're extremely vulnerable. Even attackers with good mobility, like Blaze Kick, Flame Charge Cinderace, that has multiple dashes with an eject button, things like that, you're still really vulnerable to some of the enemies dashing in on you. So you want to make sure if you do have any mobility in your kit, that you have that available once your opponents try to move in. And even if your defender player or support on your team is not really doing their job right, they're not getting you great vision, they're not sort of zoning out the enemies, peeling them off of you, Even if they're not doing that, trying as best you can to sort of play in proximity around them and use them as a defender, use them as that shield so that you can get the damage you need. I think that's extremely valuable. So your positioning is key. And like I said before, you deciding whether or not this is a good comp for an attacker really, really matters. Now let's talk about a few attackers that are doing well in this meta right now. Delphox is actually performing extremely well because of the buffed Mystical Fire Flame Charge build. So this is back to sort of carry Delphox of a few years ago, right? A powerful build, has a lot of mobility in its kit, and its Unite move is extremely impactful. Alolan Raichu's Electro Ball Thunderbolt build is extremely good. The burst potential from this move is insane. If you set it up right, you can get huge KOs on your opponents and also set up objectives and wild Pokemon to go down almost immediately for your team, which is very, very valuable. Stored power has fallen off considerably, but Electro Ball Thunderbolt, really good. Miraidon with Electro Drift and Parabolic Charge, still doing extremely well, and you'll notice something here. It's like either these attackers have ludicrous burst, and even with Raichu, some pretty good mobility with that burst, or they're very, very mobile inside their kit. Miraidon also is strangely tanky. I think a lot of people don't expect this Pokemon to be so unbelievably tanky. So Electro Drift, Parabolic Charge, still doing really well, but Charge Beam is still a positive win rate build. And a Pokemon that's impressing with both builds right now, whether it's Giga Drain, Petal Dance, or Sludge Bomb Solar Beam, is Sableye. No, can you imagine? It's Venusaur. Venusaur is doing really well. I do think Solar Beam is incredibly strong, and people are finding a lot of success with Giga Drain, I think solely because Venusaur is one of those attackers that once it hits level 13, a lot of attackers kind of are insane at that point, but Venusaur becomes a bit of a raid boss, and with so much experience on the map, you're actually seeing this happen in most Venu games. And I have to mention that Armarouge is doing well. Interestingly enough, Armor Cannon is actually the highest win rate build right now, which I'm surprised by because I still think Fire Spin is insanely good, but Armor Cannon Psyshock is doing very, very well. So if you're looking for a few attackers, those ones are crushing it. So while I don't think attackers are useless, I do think they're struggling compared to some of the other roles, and they're definitely the role that I would not be double picking right now in this meta. Let me know what you think about attackers, what you think about this meta in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I love you guys. I'll see y'all next time. We did it.